We're very pleased to have Ellen Kruger and Kemlin Nembhard here to lead our conversation. Ellen is a longtime women's health activist. She was the founding board chair of the Women's Health Clinic, which opened in 1981, and was the chairwoman of and spokesperson for the Coalition for Reproductive Choice from 1981 to 1989. Kemlin is currently the executive director of the Women's Health Clinic in Winnipeg. So tonight, Ellen and Kemlin will talk to us about reproductive choice for women. Reproductive choice is about access to reproductive health services and is a social justice issue to in part guarantee the charter right of security of person for women. Their presentation tonight is going to be divided into three parts. Very quickly, Ellen will speak about the 1980s and the organizing and the success of the long campaign for reproductive choice that resulted in the elimination of laws restricting abortion services in Canada. Kemlin will bring us up to date about what's going on now for the provision of reproductive health services in Manitoba and Canada. And then Ellen and Kemlin will talk about what needs to be done in the future to expand and entrench those health services for women, and how we need to prepare our community for what they see as the very probable onslaught against reproductive services that's bound to come into Canada from the United States. So Ellen and Kemlin will speak for about 30 minutes, and after that, we're going to invite all of you to join in a conversation with them about how we create a better reproductive health services for women in the future. Just before I turn this over to Ellen and Kemlin, you just saw that little note. This tonight's session is going to be recorded, and it'll be available on CCPA's YouTube channel, and you'll get an email later on to tell you how to do that. So now, without any more ado, I'll turn this over to Ellen. Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks, Wayne. I thought I'd remind us all of the important date. January 28th, 1988 was the Supreme Court decision that eliminated criminal abortion laws in Canada. And that was the culmination of 7 years of intense activism by the women's movement right across the nation. And going back to that, we had two ways that happened. Certainly the organizing across the nation had started in the 70s. And before that, the women in the 60s were working on abortion and birth control access and so on. But in the about 1974, Canadian Abortion Rights Action League started a national organization where there was communication from province to province. So here in Manitoba, I got invited to the national conference and came back to Winnipeg and started a Canadian Abortion Rights Action League branch here in Winnipeg, reaching out to women, taking in memberships, etc. So because it was a federal law, we recognized it needed to be a federal national movement. And because it was a law, it was Henry Morgentaler, Dr. Henry Morgentaler, who recognized that the way we might get rid of this law was to challenge it by actually breaking it. So the movement itself, we did the organizing and down on the ground in every city and the towns across this country. But it was Henry who had the bravery to go ahead establishing freestanding abortion clinics, because he knew he would likely get arrested. And he knew then there could be a challenge to the constitutionality of the law. And so, we worked hand in hand with Henry for sure, but all of that groundwork and the organizing within the cities was done by the women's movement. And that was, the maximum movement focus was over 7 years, from 1981 in Winnipeg anyway, from 1981 to 1988. So Henry called in 81, said he was going to establish a clinic here. He thought because we had an NDP government, might be smooth sailing, little miscalculation there. However, we fought it, and we fought hard. So I think we did look at access to abortion at the time when we were starting in 81. For those who don't know, there were therapeutic, women could get an abortion only if they were approved by a therapeutic abortion committee made up of 3 doctors at a hospital who agreed to have an abortion committee, because there was no compulsion to have one. So some cities had one committee, lots had none. We had 2, I think, in Winnipeg at the time. And that committee had to ascertain that the continuation of the pregnancy would be likely to endanger the life and health of the woman. If they did not agree with that, then the woman would be turned down by the abortion committee. And of course, those things get backlogged. Women were often waiting well past the 12 weeks, moved into a it gets, the longer the pregnancy continues, the more danger it is to the woman's health. So the therapeutic abortion committees, 1, most people didn't know how to access them. 2, they delayed abortions, making abortion even more dangerous. It's not a dangerous procedure when done quickly and around 6 to 8 to 10 weeks. But very often people were delayed to 12, 14, 16 weeks because of lack of knowledge of knowing how to get them, and because of the delays of the abortion committee itself. So that background, I think, gives us the important setting. And I think, you know how things kind of, the time feels right for things. I think things were coming together during the 80s. More women, you certainly had more feminists across the nation. You had, I think the time was right for this fight. And the thing that we did at that time have all kinds of circles of feminist groups across the country. I think today we're even more scattered as feminists as far as how do we reorganize to make the fight now. And we certainly didn't imagine that nearly 35 years later, although we have access to birth control and abortion services in our major cities, in Winnipeg, it's still very little access outside major cities in Canada. And that goes for access to birth control as well as abortion services. I would never have believed it if someone told me 35 years after 1988, we still wouldn't have a good access for women in this country. So that's something we need to talk about in today's discussion. I wanted to also talk about, and the decision, the Supreme Court decision, January 28th, 1988, the Supreme Court agreed that to deny women abortion denied them the right to security of the person. So we have a very different situation here in Canada than in the United States. We have a constitutional right to security of the person. So the fight will be much different here, but I think it's really important for people to recognize we're going to have a fight here too. It will come. It'll come differently. I'll talk a little bit about how we organized within the coalition. When we already had the Abortion Rights Action League going, Women's Liberation was going, there were many women's organizations. However, we recognized that public awareness of the need for abortion and public awareness of how many people, in fact, supported women's right to abortion was limited. So we realized we had to organize broadly across many sectors. So we formed the Coalition for Reproductive Choice, went to every organization we knew that was pro-choice, got them to sign on as members of the organization. And we knew we needed teachers, lawyers, doctors, nurses, the public, we needed churches, we needed all kinds of people. We couldn't get the Law Society, but we had Manitoba Women in the Law. We couldn't get the physicians, but we had pro-choice physicians who formed Doctors for Choice. We had Teachers for Choice because we didn't have the Teachers Association. We had smaller groups, those who were pro-choice within their professional group organized other pro-choice people, got them to agree that they would be an organization. Their name went on our list. In the end, we probably had 30 to 35 member organizations within that coalition. On top of that, so there was conversation going all the time. And then once Henry opened the clinic, it was news all the time. And women came out saying, what are you doing? Women came out on their own to support the clinic. It was just like shocking at the time how much that happened. But we also we knew we needed to fundraise, one for legal bills, because Henry was going to get dragged through the courts, which he was. We also need money for public education. I think it was 84, we successfully raised over, I think it was something like $129,000 that year. And we had a huge campaign. We had journalists, CBC, CTV journalists who formed a publicity committee. They developed TV ads, radio ads, billboard ads, and that money went into paying for that. Their labor was all free. Everybody else's labor in the coalition was free, but we had the broadest campaign I've ever seen in this province in my time. And I think that all of those things together, the talk within organizations, the campaigns, we had public meetings, we had forums with religious leaders of different religions. We had brought in Catholics for Choice from the US, and had panels with 300 people would show up to those meetings because we wanted to reach those churches that weren't already preaching against abortion from the pulpit, because many were. So I want to talk later when we talk about what we have to do. But that broad reaching out and the broad making sure the public knows that there's support in every sector, city, province, and across the country is part of the organizing, I think. So I should stop at that point and hand it over to Kemlin, who I see there. To Kemlin. Can she hear me?
There we go. Should I just, okay.
Go ahead, Kemlin.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Yeah, like I think a lot of those, there's a lot of lessons I think we can learn from the fight, all those years ago that I think we need to bring to today. But in terms of what the situation is today, like you said, Ellen, right? The issue, really, the biggest issue that we have here in Canada is around access. And really, to me, this isn't just about reproductive choice. This is about reproductive justice. Like ultimately, and I think that's what we need to call it. This is about reproductive justice. And so when I'm talking about access, there's issues of access in a number of ways. So, and Ellen touched on some of those things. So the first thing is that access is not equal. So first of all, most abortion care services are located in large centers, often in the southern part of whichever jurisdiction that they're in. So that's the first thing. There's, in large centers. The second thing is that it's not necessarily available in every jurisdiction. So there's like Nunavut, I think, doesn't have any access to abortion care. There's nowhere you can get it in the territory. In some places, they're only available in hospitals, and not every hospital actually provides it. So, in New Brunswick, for instance, it's only available in one hospital, and it's not available every day. So even within that jurisdiction itself, even though they have some access, you have to travel great distances within your province to get it, and you have to go to a hospital to get it. So that's part of the issue. I know for us, we're a community health clinic, and we actually provide the majority of abortions in Manitoba. Abortions are provided, like especially if you're looking at surgical abortions or aspiration abortions, those are provided either through us, through Health Science Center, and at Brandon Hospital on once or twice a week. Other than that, they're not available anywhere else in Manitoba. And then for medication abortions, which has only been legal since about 5 years, was approved through Health Canada, the availability is quite spotty. And part of that is also, again, part of the access issue, right? So first of all, if if you're coming to a clinic or to like a hospital to get it, people have to travel great distances often to get access to it, which has huge impacts on access because first of all, if you live remotely, if you're living in a northern or rural location, you're having to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to get access to abortion care often. You have to take time off work. You have to, if you have children, you have to figure out childcare. You're having to pay for travel. Then you also have to pay for accommodation when you're away, right? So all of those things create barriers to access and create barriers to access in particular for people who are the most marginalized. So people who are low income and particularly people, people who are racialized and Indigenous people who are often people who have already issues accessing the healthcare system itself. And this is creating an even greater barrier to those things. Apart from that, there are also access to things like if you're looking at medication abortion is something that is just a prescription, right? Like you do need to get a blood test, but you just need a prescription. It's something that should be provided by every general practitioner. You should be able to get that from your doctor, get a prescription from your doctor. There is no reason that you shouldn't, except that very few practitioners are actually trained. It's not something that is taught in medical school. Practitioners have to go out of their way to actually get training. And so it's something that they do, once they're practicing. So that, again, creates an issue of access. The other thing is that you also have to have access to it in pharmacies. The medication itself is not necessarily carried in every pharmacy, which again creates an issue of access. So, if you're looking, if you live in a larger city and you have a practitioner that can do that for you, you have a choice of different pharmacies. In some rural and northern communities, they may not even have a pharmacy in their community. Apart from that, they may know the pharmacist and may not necessarily, maybe someone they have known all their lives, and they don't necessarily want to have, that information accessible to someone they've known since, they were a young child. Again, creating an issue of access for people. If it's not available widely in pharmacies in every community, again, that is creating an issue of access. So those are some of the key issues, I would say. And I also want to talk a little bit about, the training, because if you look at basic reproductive care for people that have uteruses, those are things that actually are not taught in basic medical schools, which to me is an issue of reproductive justice. The fact that a practitioner has to go out of their way to even be able to provide a medication abortion is egregious to me, right? And that is also something that we can't forget about, because that in itself creates an issue of access. Another piece too around that is there's also a really big difference between providing care in a community clinic versus providing care in a hospital. For us, I'll use us as an example. When you come to us for an abortion, it's a one-day procedure. And in fact, it doesn't even necessarily have to be that long. It can be anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, everything from, doing all your tests, and then whether it's aspiration or medication abortion. If you get it at the hospital, it's at least a 2-day procedure. You have to go get your tests, go in and come back the next day to get the procedure or the prescription. And that to me, again, compounds that issue of access, right? If someone is coming from out of town, they're not only having to stay overnight one day and pay for all that accommodation and food and so on and so forth, they're paying that for at least 2 days. They're taking at least 2 days off work, right? So, like it's really, really prohibitive. So I think, those are I think some of the biggest issues that we see. Some other issues that we see as well in terms of access is for people that don't have access to a Canadian medical card. So if you get a procedure in a hospital, I know here in Manitoba, if you don't have a Canadian medical card or insurance, and you go to Health Science Center to get an abortion, you're paying between $5,000 and $10,000. So if you want to talk about lack of access, that's something that is a huge barrier for people who are like international students, people who are migrant workers. Like, these are huge issues of access, which then create also issues of for people's health, right? Creating huge issues of stress for people, and often put people in precarious situations where they may do drastic things that have an impact on their own health and their own life potentially. And so, for us, if you come to us, we do charge, but it's a very basic amount. And we also have a program that people can apply to help offset those costs, right? But that isn't the case if you're going to a hospital. So again, when you look at the issue across the board, right, they're all compounding, right? The lack of practitioners, the lack of places where you can get them, just the ramifications for people that are marginalized, that don't have a lot of resources. All of those things compound to really create a huge issue of access that to me is, again, like I said, an issue of around justice. It's not just about choice, it's about justice, because it's well beyond not having a choice. It's not just. And in terms of thinking about some of the things that are happening in the States, and I just want to touch on that a little bit, because that is one of the questions that I've also gotten a lot over the last summer, since the decision that happened in the States, is even, there are some very direct things that are happening in the States that can have an impact on us, but there are also lots of indirect things. So we, at our clinic, we actually see people not just in Manitoba, we see people from Northwestern Ontario, from Saskatchewan, as well as from the States, and we have for many, many years. And that has to do, again, with that issue of access, because if you look Northwestern Ontario, there's no hospital. I don't think they don't do them in Thunder Bay, for instance, right? So people have to go to Toronto, as an example, to get access. There's no public community clinic in Saskatchewan. It's not in southern Saskatchewan where people can go. So people come to us across borders. Some of the issues that are happening in the States are also creating a really chilly climate for people to access care, and also for practitioners to practice, not just in the States, but also in Canada. So some examples of that are some of the crazy laws that a lot of these legislatures are trying to pass are things like they are threatening to sue practitioners, clinics, the nurses, the medical assistants that provide care, abortion care to people that are from their states. So if, let's say, somebody from North Dakota came here to access an abortion, what they're saying is they're going to try and pursue people across borders and pursue the practitioners and the clinics across borders for providing that care. Not only that, there's also been talk of, people wanting to get the medication abortion prescription through the mail. Many states have talked about trying to persecute people for getting the prescriptions through the mail, which, to me, has all sorts of crazy ramifications. And I just want to stress, when people, I don't even know how they would even know that people would have access and medication abortion. Because when you get a medication abortion, it, for all intents and purposes, it looks like a miscarriage. So how they would even know that is, is kind of going off into sort of big brotherhood. But apart from that, what it also means is, when you get a medication abortion, often what happens, it's two sets of pills. People go home and take them and then monitor. If someone is feeling unsure about the process and then presents at a hospital, as an example, with, let's say, bleeding that may be completely normal, part of the fear is that they will then be, persecuted for having gotten an abortion, when it could easily be a medication, it could easily be a miscarriage, right? Because, like I said, there's no way, once a person takes the medication, there's no way to tell whether that person had an abortion or a medication abortion, or whether they had a miscarriage. So again, when you're talking about some of that chilly climate, it's about people feeling fear to even get care, because they don't know what the ramifications are going to be if they have any side effects, or if they have any questions, feeling like they can't go to a practitioner for fear of being arrested or being prosecuted. And it's also had an impact on practitioners, both in the States and in Canada. So many practitioners have now left states that have either outlawed or severely restricted access to abortion. Like, that's already happening now, because they are either being persecuted now or are being afraid of being persecuted for providing abortion care. And doctors here are concerned because they're worried that they are going to be sued potentially by an American state for providing care to an American citizen, which, generally speaking, I would say is fairly outlandish, because it's legal here in Canada. But part of the fear too is, if, let's say, a doctor at our clinic, for instance, provides abortion care to an American and is traveling or even transiting through the States, part of the worry is that once they enter the States, they will then be prosecuted. So the ramifications are not just the things that seem really obvious, I guess. The ramifications are also about the chilly climate that is being created. It's also about the issue of people being afraid to access care because they're afraid of being persecuted. And it's also about, like in the States, certainly when people are leaving states now, it's going to mean that all of these people that used to have access, abortion providers provide often more things than just abortions. They provide all sorts of reproductive care. But what that means is, when they're leaving states, all of that, there's a lot less people to provide that care to the population of those states, right? And so again, the ramifications are significant and far-reaching. Apart from all the rhetoric, that we're hearing, and the impact that can have, that's having in the States itself, that's having here across the border, there are also other ramifications that I think we also need to keep in mind. And so I think, I'll finish it there and just sort of just with one last thought, but is that I think what it leaves me, has left me, really strongly feeling is that, first of all, we cannot take for granted the things that we have, right? We cannot take for granted the fact that it's a right in Canada that we do have some access to abortion care, and that we can't take that for granted, but that we also need to make sure that we don't take our foot off the gas, that we need to actually be pursuing this as an issue of reproductive justice, and that we need to be pursuing this as a way that not only do we feel that it's important that this is provided the way it is now, but that it needs to be enhanced, that it needs to be provided across the country, in every jurisdiction, that we should be lobbying, our governments, both federally and provincially. We should also be lobbying medical schools that reproductive care for people with uteruses are things that should be taught in medical schools, that it shouldn't be, you know, a sort of offshoot of things that doctors have to go and find in their spare time. So I think I'll leave it there for now. And yeah.
Mhm.
Ellen, did you want to add in anything at this, to this last part of the presentation?
I don't think so, other than, I talked about the fact that I think when we're organizing, we need to do it very broadly across all sectors. And again, be public about it. In fact, a huge number of people in Canada, the majority of Canadians really support reproductive justice, a choice. But we also need to start talking about how do we entrench the services that are needed, as Kemlin was talking about, and then how do we organize? Because we don't have a women's liberation group anymore, or how do we do that in 2023, which it'll be. So I think that's that part of the focus of this next bit of discussion.
Yeah, and I would love to add something on to that too. One of the things, like you said, Ellen, there's really broad support for this in the population, and so I think that's one of the things that really became obvious in the spring and summer for us. You know, when even from when the draft judgment came out in May, we, you know, have we've been inundated with media across Canada, in the States, even in Europe, asking about it. And what's really interesting is we have seen a huge level of support from people in the community, a huge outpouring of support from people in the community. You know, as an example, one really great example I'll say is, you know, I think it was in June, you know, right at the height of all of this happening. At one point I was, you know, in the office, and I got a knock on the door from someone from the front desk, and she was very excited, and she said, "Kemlin, you know, a guy just, you know, heard you on the radio yesterday and came down and gave us $700 in cash of a donation, because he felt that, you know, this was such an important, like, he was so supportive. It was so important that access to abortion care, that access to safe abortion care is not only maintained but enhanced, and that, you know, he just wanted to come down and make sure that we could continue to provide the services that we do, and that we could not only that provide it to as many people as possible, in a safe environment, and that it's free, right? And that's what we do. We don't charge anybody. So and so that, I think, was a really, really good demonstration of exactly where things were at, you know, and that's what we've seen from the spring all the way into the fall, is that I think, you know, people are very much supportive.
Mm.
Okay, if neither of you have more to add, then maybe I'll thank you both for this great presentation. It's the lots to think about and lots to talk about, and we can move now into the conversation part of our evening. Before we do that, I'm going to ask Karen, how are we doing this? Is it all going to be through the chat?
I think when people raise their hand, then we can just unmute them, and
Okay.
people will be allowed to ask the questions directly.
Okay, so we'll do that. You can use the chat function and raise your virtual hand, and when you do that, Karen will unmute you. And remember to lower your hand when you're done. Also, let's remember to keep our questions and comments both respectful and short. We want to hear from as many people as we can. And, so we'll have, looks like we're going to have about another half an hour or so for the conversation. So I'll open it up now to anyone have a question for either Ellen or Kemlin.
We also need ideas of strategies.
Oh, Anne is also saying that the Q&A function also works, so you can ask a question in there. At any rate. Okay, we have somebody with their hand up. Karen, are you doing this or am I doing it?
I let, it's Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Excellent information tonight. Lots of memories of, I guess, 35 years ago. I think I still have a choice button over there in the dresser drawer. This is kind of a tactical suggestion. Could we emphasize, instead of choice, reproductive health care? This is health care. I know that doctors in the US have been, in some cases, reluctant or cautious to provide health care, such as a woman might need in the case of an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage, also known as a spontaneous abortion. And it just seems to me, also justice is certainly an issue, but thinking in terms of abortion as a healthcare procedure rather than simply a choice. Is that at all helpful?
I don't know if you want to talk about that, Ellen, or if you want me to.
I think often it is referred to as reproductive health care. But I think the other issue why it sometimes is not is that the word abortion or termination, pregnancy termination, used to be not used because it was kind of a scary topic. And I think so there's a bit of a struggle between calling, you're right, the services are broad. It's not just abortion services, it's birth control, it's STD, it's all kinds of reproductive health care. So that I think that using that term is helpful in many ways. In other ways, I think some people see that as avoiding the controversy of the issue of abortion. So I don't know, what do you think, Kemlin?
Yeah, like, I mean, I think it's important to actually say both. This is healthcare, right? Which is why I think it, part of the issue is that the fact that it's not taught in medical school is egregious, right? And absolutely, I think we need to talk about it in those terms. And that's why, again, it should be available. You should be able to get it from your general practitioner, right? This is healthcare. And so absolutely, I think we need to talk about it that way. But I also think, when I think about many of the clients that we serve, I think it is really important not to lose that idea around choice, because that's ultimately what it is. People are making a choice for what's best in their lives at the time in their life. And I think it's really important that we provide people the agency to make those choices, right? Like, not provide them agency, but accord them, recognize that they have the agency to make those choices, right? And we just need to give them the information and the resources so that they can make the best choices for their lives. And so for me, I think it is really important that we actually use both of those terms, being really clear, again, that this is healthcare, right? That is exactly what it is. It should be provided exactly the same way as any other procedure, because it is basic healthcare. But again, I think that issue of choice, I think, is really important not to lose.
we have other questions? Sorry, Kemlin, you. wanted to
Yeah, I
say-
was just gonna say, and I think it's really important too that we, the situation like in the States, like while there are lots of similarities between us and the States, I think it's also important to recognize that there are also lots of differences between us and the States. And so I don't want to, I think it can be a bit dangerous sometimes if we draw too close an association. I think both in terms of just generally how our laws work are very different, right? And how it is enshrined in our laws, I think, make it in many ways safer from a legislative perspective than it is in the States. And then I think it's also important to think about just in terms of culturally, we're very different than the States. And, they're much more, I would say, religiously tied in the States than we are. We are a much more secular population. And I think that also should impact how we talk about it, right? Many of the arguments in the States, especially now, are very much, they're kind of dancing around a lot of sort of religious conversations and religious terms. And I don't think we want to go down that road at all. I think we want to just call it what it is. Right. And again, just recognize that we, I think our story is different than the States. And so I don't think we want to tie ourselves too closely to the story of abortion in the States as they do here. Like as tie ourselves too closely to the story of abortion and abortion, rights to abortion in the States.
One of the things I think maybe it's already started and I'm out of it, but the lobbying of the medical school to get medication abortions taught in school seems to me something we could be doing right now that could improve access. And certainly Jacqueline Donner she and some other medical residents a couple of years ago did a huge campaign to ensure access to medication abortion. I'm sure some of those women in medical school, I'm not sure where she's at now, but some of those women could help us with the lobbying that could get going. And we could do that. We could start that right away, which would be, if we could get that going, would be the beginning of better access in a small way and something that's, I think, doable.
Yep, absolutely. And we would absolutely be right on board with that. Because like I said, that is one of the biggest barriers to access. One of the benefits of medication abortion, one of the sort of not just benefits, but one of the potential benefits of medication abortion is actually to really make it accessible, to make abortion care really accessible to the majority of the population, right? And so we are not fulfilling that potential. And right now, to be trained even to provide medication abortion. So we've hosted a bunch of training through the National Abortion Federation. They do a bunch of training around it. And so we've sort of hosted and tried to train a bunch of people along with them in different communities in the North, as well as in other communities in the South, right? But it really shouldn't be a small community clinic that's doing that, right? Like ultimately, and quite frankly, it also shouldn't necessarily have to be the National Abortion Federation that does it. It should actually, like you said, come from medical schools, right? And so I think that would be, I'm not sure how easy it would be, because I think the sort of medical system itself is pretty, it's based on, cis men, right? That is what that's what the medical system is based on. And this is a perfect example of that, right? And so, but that doesn't mean I would shy away from it. So I think that is definitely one thing that we should be working on, is to actually get it taught in medical school.
There's a question in the Q&A from Susan. Have either of you had experience with promoting or providing services or seeking support in communities, for example, Indigenous and immigrant communities where fundamentalist Christian churches who are usually vehemently anti-choice often dominant? And what are the strategic possibilities there?
I would say, like, I don't know if you have anything for that to answer that, Ellen.
Yeah.
I think it would depend on, often it just depends on the practitioners, right? Because we do have practitioners, for instance, in some communities that are, very religious, like have a very strong religious basis. It's just a matter of finding practitioners that are committed to it. And we have done that in many communities, like I said, in the north, as well as in some other communities outside of Winnipeg, where we have actually worked to help providers train so they can provide medication abortion. And then we also have a referral. So, if people from out of town call us looking for an abortion, depending on how far they are in their weeks, we now have a list of practitioners across the province that we can refer to, so people can not necessarily have to come all the way to Winnipeg to get access to abortion. So we do that, but I think, but not in a, not so much going into the community and like hosting a table or something, but actually just working with providers in the community. I think it's also, which makes me think, I think it's also important to recognize that there is still somewhat of a stigma for some practitioners, like for practitioners to provide abortion care, right? And so even doing that can, some practitioners don't want their name widely publicized. And I think it's important to recognize that especially if you're in a small community, practitioners may provide that service, but they wouldn't necessarily publicize it widely, because there may be ramifications for them and their families in those communities, right? And so I think we should never forget that reality that people do face. I hope that answered the question.
Ellen, did you have anything you wanted to add to this, the question about the fundamentalist Christian communities?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Sounds like things are still working much like they did in the 70s and 80s as far as the good list.
Wayne, there's a question. I see there's a question in the webinar chat. I don't know if you can see it.
The webinar chat. There's the question in the webinar chat is, are there this is actually from Karen. Are abortions available in Brandon, Portage, Thompson, and Churchill?
So I can answer that question. Abortions are available in Brandon. There is a practitioner, I don't believe so, in either Portage or Thompson or Churchill, but there are a few practitioners in different communities close to Portage and close to Thompson, certainly. I also want to be, respectful in terms of not sort of naming necessarily the exact communities where they are, just because there may not be that many practitioners in smaller communities. Again, just so people, respecting their privacy around that.
Here's one again from Virginia. This is a suggestion for a group that needs to get involved. People like me who have young adult granddaughters. You know if it's a question, but
We do. And we need to get those granddaughters involved too.
There you go. There's another question in the Q&A from John Sears. John says, it seems that the Manitoba College of Pharmacists is further along. encouraging but not requiring, I gotta get my glasses on, sorry. Special training to dispense, I can't read this, mifgamiso,
Mifigaiso.
Mifigaiso. How did the co-farm get there, and is there a model there?
Mm.
I know we have done a lot of work since Miffy was approved to actually increase the access in pharmacies. So we've actually been doing a lot of work around that. Because like I said earlier, that is one of the key things around access is actually being able to have access just to the prescriptions at a pharmacy close to your community.
Anyone with their hand? Oh, there's another one here in the Q&A from Anne. Speaking from the perspective of a health science student, I think there is a lot of room to engage with all the health related programs, the undergrad and grad level, to increase the understanding of the implications of access to abortion and get some information on the history of the clinics that are operational today.
Okay. Oh,
There's only one operational today, and that's Women's Health Clinic.
Right.
So, I mean, there's others in Canada, but it's limited. Yeah. So we do need that work to be done. A whole medical lobbying committee.
Yep.
With branches. Mhm.
And did she say not just
Yeah.
doctor, but
No,
all the
no.
health-related programs? Yeah.
Mhm.
Do we have any other?
I also, I guess while we're talking about that, I would also love to stress for people that it's important that we also make sure not to forget, we need to also lobby our governments, the federal government and provincial government, around increasing access. I think, like I have to say, it was really good to hear our Prime Minister again and again come out this summer, like very clearly, not just in support, but saying that we would also be providing care to Americans if they were looking for care, right? Like being very clear about that support. And I can't stress how important that is to hear that from our political leaders. But the other piece is our provincial government has a really key role to play in providing access to care. And so as an example, we get funded to provide a certain amount of abortions per year. So we get funded to provide 1,600 procedures per year. We actually provide about a quarter to a third more than that every year. And we do that because we have we have the abortion clinic and our medical program, and we figure out how to do that that way, but we still have to turn away people. As an example, this year we had to turn away upwards of 500 people, where we just had to say to them, we have too long of a wait list. We will not be able to see you in time, because at our clinic, we only provide surgical abortions up to 16 weeks. To provide higher than that, you need a larger sort of surgical suite that is at the hospital, a more intense sort of surgical suite. And so like we had to say to upwards of 500 people this year, we won't be able to see you in time for you to be served within that 16-week period. And we had to just turn them away. And ultimately, we could serve those people if the government provided us more funding to provide extra abortions every year, right? And so the provincial government has a key role to play in this. And, in terms of actually funding to provide more procedures every year. So I really want to stress that, because I think that is one of the things that we need to do. Not just us, like we do that constantly, but I think as a movement, we need to actually really push our provincial government to increase funding to provide more procedures every year.
Is there a public education outreach or lobbying committee of the Board of Women's Health Clinic?
We do actually. It was dormant for a while, but we do have one. But a lot of that stuff is done primarily through like our staff, actually.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But do you need a board committee? Is this the time?
Well, we do have an advocacy committee right now. So, yeah, but like I said, you know, I think it would also be even better for people, for our, for the government to hear it, not just from us, but to actually to hear it from Manitobans, right? Because they hear it from us all the time. And so I think what's even more important is for everyday citizens to write, call, email their, you know, politicians and tell them how important this is. I think it's really important for, you know, our coalition partners, you know, in the community and, you know, agencies in the community to also write, call, and talk to their, you know, the provincial government and tell them how important it is and that they should be increasing the funding and increasing access to abortion care in the province.
I have a kind
Okay,
of question.
thanks. That's helpful, Kemlin.
Sorry, that kind of connects with that. And I know that I understand from what you're saying, but the situation and context in Canada is different than the United States. But I wonder, is there it appears in the US there's a very well organized, well financed anti-choice movement that's been working for a lot of years to do the things that they've done recently. But is there the same thing in Canada? Is there that you know the choice movement has to also be aware of and you know, is working in the opposite direction?
Absolutely. There, you know, as an example, the day that the day after the US Supreme Court made the decision, there was a rally outside the Ledge and, you know, anti-abortion rally outside the Ledge. It was very small, but they were obviously ready for it. At the same time, there was a larger counter rally from people who were in support. So absolutely, there is organizing here, you know, and I think if you look particularly at the federal conservative leader, you know, I think they're, you know, right hand in glove with that. So I don't think we should never underestimate that, and we should never underestimate the impact of that. But I think one of the best ways of doing that is we have to continually talk about it, right? Because that is part of the reason I think that it got to the place that it is in the States. And, you know, for so long, people just took for granted these rights that they had, took for granted that they were these services and that these rights were going to always be there. And so in that silence, that is where those, you know, anti-abortion activists really organized, right? It was in that silence. And so we cannot remain silent. That to me is the thing that we need to do, is we need to be as vocal in as many ways as possible. And again, that's whether or not, you know, you are talking to your MLA, your MP, whether you are talking to your neighbor, whether you're volunteering at agencies that help support reproductive justice, right? Like, I think there are lots of different ways, but we just can't remain silent.
There's actually several more questions in the Q&A from Keith. Are there champions of expanding access among the key professional associations and the main political parties?
Hmm.
Are there champions of the,
Of expanding access among the key professional associations and the main political parties? Are they on board?
I can't speak to the key professional associations. I mean, certainly there are lots of champions within, the sort of doctors of physicians and surgeons, right? There are absolutely champions there. And in turn, but I can't speak too much about that really. But absolutely there are champions within the different political parties. I think, provincially, the NDP has very much been supportive. They've I know Nahani has in the fall last year, she organized a big, pro-choice rally, right? Like, so there's definitely support there. I think federally in the NDP, there's lots of support. Federally in the Liberals, if the Prime Minister's position speaks to the party, I would assume that there are definitely champions within that party as well. The provincial Liberals have remained fairly silent on it. And the Conservatives have remained, I would say, provincial Conservatives have remained, I would say, silent on it as well. I think it would, if you look at the Conservatives, I think it would also really depend on what different generations. Funnily enough, if you look at generations, let's say 60s, 70s, 80s, there are strong champions around choice, strong champions around reproductive care. And we've had people reach out to us from people who are, traditional conservatives who have expressed that. I think the place where you see it less, or it's a little bit more nebulous, is some of the more contemporary conservatives. So they either remain silent or are really vocal, like the federal conservative leader.
I think that's a place that probably some work should be done, is woman to woman within the, with conservative women, because there's lots of them. And certainly by the time they're getting to my age, they have some clout within their party, partly because they are donors and partly because they're longtime members, and they're there. They were there in the 80s, and as you said, they're still there. So working perhaps through some of the senior conservative members to get them working within their own party might be an avenue. And one would have to ferret out who those people are. I'm not sure who they are anymore, but I know people who could tell me. So that's work that could be done, and I think would be important to be done even around the issue of more funds for Women's Health Clinic to be able to do more procedures. And it can be done within the party and with the nudging to the minister without that ever being a public thing, but just influence within the party. And it should be happening within all the parties, making sure that we're secure. Yeah. We had lots of internal fights with NDP ministers, let me tell you, in the 80s, huge fights, because there were anti-choice ministers. For a while, the Minister of Health did not help. So those fights need to be had and secured even within the NDP.
Right. We just have a few more minutes. There's a comment and two quick questions, and then maybe we'll call it then. So the comments from Lisa. She says, I just want to remind folks there's a provincial election coming up. So this is a good year to make greater abortion access an issue. People should call their parties and the candidates. And so a question from Chris, could guidance counselors in schools help educate high school students about the issues to access to reproductive or to abortion and the US politics spilling into Canada?
Absolutely. I mean, like I think as an issue of healthcare and an issue of justice, absolutely, right? You know, again, yeah, I would say, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure what role we could play so much like in supporting that. Yeah.
Mhm.
The role we used to play, I did some of these speaking when I worked at K Clinic. In those days, the guidance counselor would always have permission to talk about things like birth control or abortion, but she could invite a speaker and oops, they were talking about that. So that kind of stuff happened. Oh, well, I'll invite Ellen and she can talk about that. And I'll have me off the hook.
Right
And
on.
it certainly was one school that I did that in. I'm sure it happened in lots of other places. You get an outside agency to come in and do it if it's not safe for you, the teacher. And I'm sure there's schools where it's still not safe. So that can happen through the community clinics, through calling sympathetic doctors. I don't know. But
Right.
I don't know if the pregnancy counseling arm of Women's Health Clinic still does speaking engagements, but we used to do it.
We do, and we do we have a health education program, and so we actually do work in schools that does stuff around sexual and reproductive health. And so this would be part of the basket of things that we would talk about, in terms of just sexual and reproductive health. But we don't have the resources to get into every school. But yeah, absolutely, it's something, we do that already. We get invited to schools to do things, and we absolutely would go and do that.
Okay, well, one last question from Anne. I've seen some social media groups that focus on women's personal finance that advocate for health access and abortion rights. I've not seen a Canadian-led group, but that might be something to engage with as well.
Mm. Part of the broad range of securing support through many sectors in our city, I guess that would for sure.
Okay, well, maybe at that I'll say let's thank you to Ellen and Kemlin again. This has been great. It was a great presentation, fabulous conversation, and yeah, there's an election coming up, so let's do something about that. Yeah, so again, thanks to both of you. I really appreciate you being here.